Strangeways Prison in Manchester. It's a place with a long and pretty dark history. For almost 100 years, 100 people were executed within its walls. But out of those 100, only 4 were women. So today, we're going to dig into the stories of these 4 very different cases and figure out what exactly led them to the gallows.
Okay, so to really get a handle on these stories, you've got to understand the world they were living in. Back in the early 19th century, Britain was run by something called the Bloody Code. Now, this wasn't just one law. It was a whole mess of statutes that made over 200 crimes punishable by death. And we're talking about things as small as stealing goods worth a shilling. It was brutal.
Before we had prisons like Strangeways, executions were these huge, public, and incredibly brutal spectacles. And for women, well, the punishment could be horrifyingly different from what men faced, even for the exact same crime.
I mean, just look at the difference here. For high treason, a man would be hanged, drawn, and quartered, a truly gruesome public dismemberment. A woman? For the very same crime, she would be burned at the stake.
And you want to know the official reason for this? It's pretty wild. A really influential jurist, William Blackstone, argued that burning was actually chosen to preserve a woman's decency, to avoid publicly mangling her body. It's a really chilling piece of logic that tells you everything you need to know about the attitudes of the time.
So as you can see here, things did start to change, but it was a slow, deliberate shift away from these public horror shows. In 1790, they finally stopped burning women. And then, by 1868, all executions were moved behind prison walls. It was a total transformation from a public spectacle into a private, state-run procedure.
And that brings us right to the gates of Strangeways Prison in Manchester. It opened its doors in 1868, yet the exact same year that public executions were banned. This place was literally built for this new era of private justice.
So, between the year it opened and the very last hang-in in 1964, exactly 100 people were executed on the gallows inside Strangeways. And out of that 100, this is how many were women. Just 4.
I mean, look at that disparity. 96 men and only 4 women. So the big question is, what made these 4 cases so different, so heinous, that they ended up in the execution chamber when so many other women convicted of murder were shown mercy? That's really the heart of what we're exploring today.
All right, let's dive into our first story, which takes us back to the Victorian era. It's a classic tale of a secret affair, a domestic tragedy, and a poison that was, well, disturbingly easy to get your hands on.
So, meet Mary Ann Britland. She was a 39-year-old factory worker who was having an affair with her neighbor. She decided the only way they could truly be together was to, well, remove every obstacle. And that meant her own daughter, her own husband, and her lover's wife. Her weapon of choice was a common household rat poison called Harrison's Vermin Killer, which was loaded with strychnine. The sheer cold, calculated nature of it all, poisoning 3 people one by one, including her own family, absolutely horrified Victorian society. It was seen as the ultimate betrayal of a woman's role as a nurturing mother and wife.
She insisted she was innocent right to the end, but the evidence against her was just overwhelming. For a crime that so completely subverted every single expectation of womanhood and motherhood at the time, there was just no mercy to be found. And so, Mary Ann Britland became the very first woman to be hanged at Strangeways.
Okay, fast forward 40 years. It would be that long before another woman faced the gallows at Strangeways. And this time, there was absolutely no doubt about her guilt, because it came straight from her own mouth in the final days of her life.
So, Louis Calvert was a housekeeper who got caught stealing. When her landlady confronted her, she battered the woman to death. But the real shocker came while she was in the condemned cell. She didn't just confess to that murder, she also confessed to another unsolved killing from years before. Admitting to being a double murderer, well, that pretty much eliminated any chance of reprieve.
Now, the last 2 executions of women at Strangeways happened in the years after World War II, and they share this really fascinating, if grim, connection. Both women were hanged by the most famous British executioner of the 20th century, a man named Albert Pierpoint.
And get this, look at the executioners here. Thomas Pierpoint, the guy who hanged Louis Calvert, that was Albert Pierpoint's uncle. Execution was, quite literally, the family business.
Margaret Allen's case is a deeply tragic one. She was a 42-year-old bus conductor who lived as a man, went by the name Bill, and wore men's clothes. Now, today we might look at her struggles through the lens of gender dysphoria, but in 1949, she was just seen as a strange outcast. And that nonconformity probably made her a very unsympathetic figure in court, seen as unnatural and defiant by the standards of the day.
After she battered an elderly neighbor to death with a hammer, Allen confessed right away, just saying she was in one of her funny moods. The court found her sane, and her total lack of remorse, right up to this final, defiant act on the morning she was to be hanged, left no room for mercy in the eyes of the law.
And that brings us to our final case, Louisa Merrifield, known as the Blackpool Poisoner. This one was just a story of pure, simple greed. She and her husband got hired as housekeepers for an elderly widow, convinced the woman to sign her bungalow over to them in her will, and then promptly poisoned her with rat poison. Her biggest mistake? She couldn't stop boasting about her inheritance, which made her guilt pretty obvious and her motives seem utterly cold-blooded.
Merrifield's execution in 1953 was the last of its kind. She was the final woman hanged at Strangeways, and her case came just over a decade before Britain started to dismantle capital punishment for good, bringing the whole era of the hangman to a close.
It's wild to think about it, but by this point, hanging had become this cold, methodical science. It wasn't about strangulation anymore. It was all a precise calculation of weight and distance, designed to sever the spinal cord for a quick, instantaneous death. A world away from the fiery stakes and public butchery of the past.
And this is how that whole system was finally taken apart. It started with some restrictions in 57, then the death penalty for murder was suspended in 65, and finally abolished for good in 69. By 1998, it was gone for every single crime, ending a chapter of British justice that had lasted for centuries. So, that's the question we're left with, isn't it? In a system that sent 96 men to the gallows at this one prison, what made these 4 women the exception? You had a cold-blooded poisoner, a confessed double murderer, a defiant social outcast, and a brazenly greedy killer. Their crimes weren't just seen as murder, they were seen as deep betrayals of their expected roles in society. And in the end, they were deemed so exceptional in their cruelty or their defiance that they too had to die.